I would like to thank all of the speakers for a rich and fruitful discussion. They talked about all of the economic and development issues facing the Middle East and North Africa region, specifically dependency on food imports, the food and fuel subsidies, the disconnect between demand for labor and skill sets, the poor business climate, weak governance, specifically a lack of data available on the region, and of course the fact that food security and poverty remain a key obstacle for economic development in the region. Some of the steps, ways forward that were discussed were addressing the funding gap, rethinking the governance structures, enhancing ownership and management of land, reforming social safety net programs, and addressing the knowledge and data gaps. And of course, the Arab spatial tool that Clemens talked about is a big initiative in that regard, capturing detailed information on many of the issues we addressed today. So I'd like to open it up to a question and answer session, and the way I think that we would do it is just to take maybe 3 or 4 sets of questions each. If you have a question, we'll get a microphone to you. If you could stand up and identify yourself and say to whom your question is directed, that would be extremely helpful. So open it up to the floor if anyone has any questions for any of the speakers.
Good afternoon. David Schroeder from USAID. Caroline, you talked about economic growth in the Arab world, and one thing you mentioned was competitiveness, and I think that's been a struggle for a lot of Arab countries to figure out where do they have competitiveness and where are their markets to a certain extent for them to grow from. Following China is not the solution, but they have to define those markets where they can really build their skill markets and take advantage of those skills. And so could you talk a little bit more about where you see that might lie? Agriculture obviously is maybe one little niche market area, but for the Arab world like Saudi Arabia, when they invested in agriculture, it was criticized for putting so much money into big wheat fields or irrigation systems that grew wheat. When they had the money, that wasn't really where their comparative advantage is to grow wheat. And so I think that's always a controversial area about Arab countries where, investing in agriculture unless it's in high-valued niche market opportunities. But I think the area of competitiveness is one that when I worked in Egypt, we were trying to advance that dialogue and understanding with small businesses about understanding global competitiveness and how they can link to that. It was a struggle with small family types of operations.
Any other questions at the moment? I'll group them together. If not, one more.
Rachel Trigo from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And first of all, I wanted to just make the distinction. We've been talking at some length about food security, both at the national level, but also at the micro level. And Clement, I was wondering if you could speak to us about, you've written on some various topics related to food security and looking at both that macro and micro. And I was wondering if you could speak to some examples that you've seen post-Arab awakening, both at the national level of seeing successful movement towards food security and at the household level, those types of interventions, whether addressing, again, as mentioned, employment and those types of things, or social safety nets. Thank you.
Any others at the moment? One over at this end.
Mehmet Chal, independent consultant. My question is for Mr. Corey. Brazil is thought to be a model for zero hunger in the region, as far as I understand correctly. And how it's going to be, how the implementation would be. Brazil is coming to Middle East as the role model. Could you elaborate on that?
Okay, we'll start with those 3 questions to summarize one for each of our speakers. One for Carolyn on competitiveness and markets, one for Clemens asking to provide food security examples at the national and household levels, and then the final one to Nadim on the Zero Hunger Initiative. So we'll start with Carolyn. Was
Is this on? I think I might have just turned it off.
Push the middle button, light you on.
Oh, okay. I turned it off instead of on. Thank you for the question. I think this is a very important question. In thinking about the answer, I don't think it's about trying to pick what sector they should be in, but rather about getting incentives right, and then that will happen through the market. So the Middle East and North Africa is the least integrated region in the world. Trade share is very low relative to its size. I mean, there was the comment by our now re-elected President Obama that trade in the Middle East and North Africa, a region of 350 million people, is the size of Switzerland. So the exports, the non-oil exports. So what we want is to see the competitiveness improve, obviously, but I don't think it's about saying, oh, it's got to be in this niche market or that niche market. It's much more about getting the conditions right so that labor is utilized, getting rid of the fuel subsidies that distort labor, getting an appropriate investment climate, getting macro and political stability so investors want to come in. That said, I think an important part of this is really opening up to foreign investment. Many of the countries that have seen competitiveness and trade grow have done it through bringing in foreign investors, and then there's a spillover in terms of the knowledge from those sectors, but also these guys are the ones that are selling most of the goods nowadays, and that can create a lot of jobs. There's also the example of Turkey, where we saw kind of homegrown competitiveness through the Anatolian tigers that developed over a period. But again, it came very much from getting incentives right. They got rid of high fuel subsidies rather rapidly. It was costly in the short run, huge long run gains. They joined a customs union with the European Union, and at the same time, Eastern Europe and Russia opened up, and so there was this kind of suitcase trade that developed. So it's really, again, about just getting the incentives right, and it will come. Thank you.
If I can just also add on this, that our estimates is that by changing some of these rules and having more of a freer trade just between the Arab countries, at a certain level, just there you have about 30% more trade that would happen and would address then some of these issues. The other one on food security is that there are disincentives for the local market, and probably this is also a bit close to the Turkey example that Caroline was giving, in that there is a lot that can be done at the local market if there are a bit more of these development kind of territorial development policies that address some of what people can say controversially or not are advantages to cities rather than rural areas that could at the same time have an impact on food security, but also promote more of the local markets. On the issue of how to bring Brazil to the Arab countries, it would basically, at this point, it's more of one of those areas that we are interested with organizations like IFPRI to do more research on, as to what are those, if we are going to move away from those institutionally inducing market failures and institutional failures with the subsidies that are going where they should not be going. So what do you do with those, the ones that do need assistance, that are not going to wait for the overall economy and to get better, but to just have their interventions of a safety net nature. The experience of the conditional cash transfers and those types of programs is what we need to very quickly see how to import into the region. I haven't seen until now, but maybe the other panelists have, of similar programs that have already worked, but I think this is one of the areas that we are suggesting where knowledge gaps exist. But the key issue is that globally it's already an approved, let's say, global priority to try and address the issues of safety nets through cash transfers type.
On the macro and micro side of things, thanks for bringing this up because I think it's really important. So before I start, let me just define what, along the lines of Nadim, what we think macro and micro food security entails, and most importantly, how it can be measured. Because there's a lot of confusion, especially in that region, where some people think, well, that's self-sufficiency, so we need to grow all of our food by ourselves and so on. So there is one commonly agreed indicator at the macro level of things, which is essentially tells you something about whether a country has enough foreign currency reserves to at any point in time import the food. And the indicator that we use for that is basically the ratio of food imports to total exports plus remittances, which are kind of the key inflows and outflows. So if you think about it, the lower that indicator is, the less a country spends of its foreign currency inflows to import food, so the more food secure it is. At the same time, if agriculture picks up and more food is produced, then you need to import less food, and so that indicator improves as well. So that's one of the one way to look at this. Then on the micro level, it's very much about nutrition. Access to nutritious food is the definition. So for the Arab world, we use child malnutrition as an indicator. Now, why is it so important to distinguish the two? If you look at the two maps using those two indicators, by no means is it the case that a country that has a macro issue also has a micro issue and the other way around. So the policy measures are clearly very different. If you want to tackle kind of a macro issue, that's more towards, export-led growth to get those foreign currency in. It may be in countries with potential. It may be increasing agricultural production. It may also be grain storage facilities, especially in times of volatile prices. That a little note of caution, that has huge governance implications, so there has been bad experiences with that, but if it's managed right, so these are the kind of macro interventions. On the micro side of things, obviously very different. So here we talk about malnourished children. That's not only an issue of income and poverty, that's also a big issue of access to services, especially health, education of women, and things like that. Now, a country example, we just started to work with the Egyptian government, and the issue are the food subsidies that have also been mentioned before. Now, so what can be done is tricky. So the country spends anywhere between 3 to 5% of GDP on food subsidies. That's admittedly less than fuel subsidies. But any type of reform, and people have talked about it for many decades, is difficult because people go to the street the minute it's announced. And so I think in the past all of us have focused on, the generic kind of recommendation, let's get rid of the subsidies and do the targeted transfers. That is kind of the standard prescription, which I think, especially in those difficult times and sensitive times, just won't work. So I think we have to find smart ways of reform with which everybody can be happy. And so now, to be concrete, in the case of Egypt, so luckily the government now is also looking beyond poverty and is including CAPMAS, the statistical agency, is including in their questionnaire and in their reporting all the nutrition indicators, which is great. The survey, the new survey for Egypt, is one of the most comprehensive surveys I've ever seen, because it's not only income and expenditure, but it's also anthropometric. So you can really figure out, you know, the poverty nutrition kind of story. It also amazingly has information not only in general on food, but the subsidized item and the not subsidized item, so one can really make inroads into, on a research point of view, and some preliminary findings I may just share. So we know that subsidies are a burden to the budget, and we know that they are not well targeted. We don't have to look at that again, because that's clear. So now from a nutrition point of view, the interesting story is also that Egypt has not only a very high child malnutrition rate, but it has also a very high obesity rate. It's the second highest after Jamaica in the world, in the developing world. So, and that has implications for the healthcare system, that it tends to be very expensive. So now the hypothesis and like the preliminary finding point to a direction where the food subsidy, which is mainly on calorie-dense items, bread, vegetable oil, sugar, tea, that kind of stuff, actually contributes also to the malnutrition side of things, because children, little kids, need other stuff than bread to eat to grow the brain and so on. So maybe one way to look at it in terms of reform may be, you know, to over time find other means, but in the meantime change the basket of the consumption. Maybe not only focus on sugar and vegetable oil, but maybe something that's really good for the children's development. And then, you know, over time find practical solutions, because the way I see it, getting rid of subsidies altogether in the next 5 years is just not an option, and we may have to use that like second best options.
Okay, thank you, Clemens. Next round of questions, 2 over here on this side. Brian?
Thank you. Brian Greenberg with Interaction. I wanted to say thanks for all the presentations. Wanted to raise a set of issues that I think are mostly for Nadim and Carolyn, but in general, just looking for your reactions here. First, in a region and in local areas with some pretty significant food security challenges, it's intuitively appealing to think that we need more direct investment in agriculture and food production, and that's an important way of addressing that. In a region, though, with fundamental ecological challenges for agricultural production, it may well be the case that dependence on imports is a structural reality and is not going to change. And if we want to improve food security and nutritional status, we may have to take that for granted, and that would shift priorities for investment and the policy regime that goes with it. So, for example, you might wish to invest more in human capital, infrastructure, education, those kind of priorities, enabling environment for investment and so forth, to create the kind of economic base that would allow those kinds of imports to work when, except in a few places like South Sudan, there's not a lot of potential. But if we say that there is regional interest in investing in those areas, it's useful to distinguish regional investment, outside investment for economic growth versus for economic development and for amelioration of food security. It's not obvious, for example, how large Saudi or other Gulf corporate investment in South Sudan with an export return to those countries or into global markets is going to appreciably improve the food security status of the neediest populations. And so in calling for that as a kind of a solution and the business enabling environment for that, I think it's incumbent to to define what the pathway for poverty reduction, broad-based poverty reduction, job growth, improved food security, and so forth would be with that type of investment. Excuse me. And to Carolyn, on the issue, which I think is a very interesting paradox, you have a government sector which typically has a large fraction of the employment, it's where people want to go, coupled with largely dysfunctional governance. So you have signals for a rentier, or if you will, even a parasitic kind of government relationship to the economy. The question would be, for the knowledge building community, is the assumption valid that improved information leads to improved policies and decision makings in contexts where governance and policy making it surely has a rationale to it, but it isn't necessary, the constraints to it, the binding constraints to improve policy outcomes aren't necessarily information or data deficits. They have to do with the nature of decision making and governance and the interests that are served. And that gets us into kind of the paradox of how you begin to address the weak governance that underlies a lot of these questions when outside investors and donors are often shy about attaching conditionality to their investments. Thanks. Which might potentially
Brian?
Incentivize or drive the kind of governance and policy reform that would genuinely create a different dynamic.
Brian,
so thank you.
Three-part question then? Okay, I've got it. There was one other one in that side of the room. Go ahead, thanks.
Thank you very much for your presentations. My name is Kazumi Funahashi from the Heritage Foundation. You showed us the Aswan Dam, and I think it seems to me one of the critical issues here is water. So could you address the issue of water scarcity? Has there been any discussions or policy recommendations? Thank you.
Any other questions? One on this side of the room? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Nadine Sahyoun from the University of Maryland, and I wanted to also mention that the Arab Special is very exciting. Very excited to see that a lot of information is being pulled from different places and put together in one place. I also just wanted to mention that over the last 3 years, I've been working with my colleagues at the American University of Beirut in developing the food security scale. And it has been validated, so I'm hoping that there's going to be the same tools that will be used in the different parts of the Arab world, so that we can have some data that can be comparable in the future. Thank you very much.
Any other questions? All right, so three-part question from Brian. If dependency on imports in the region is a reality, how to prioritize investments, what are the pathways for poverty reduction, and also, does improved information lead to improved policymaking? And Brian, you can correct me if those weren't the three ones. So I'll have you guys decide who wants to answer that and in what order. And then another question on talking about water scarcity, if you could offer your thoughts on water scarcity, and then just some comments on maybe how to connect and bring together the two different types of tools being developed. Okay?
I'll start with the first one and link it maybe to the water scarcity, because I think the first comment was on the ecological challenges, and certainly water would be the first one that would come to mind. The whole idea, and of course Clemens addressed it up front, which is the one of the problem with self-sufficiency, of imagining, which is actually an important, even today, an important element in the political discussion of food security. The reason the Saudis went into self-sufficiency, and they were actually exporting wheat at incredible cost, was not just because they had money. It was because there was the threat after the 1970s oil embargo, that someone was going to also do an embargo on them, on the wheat. So these were boys who knew what was going on and who wanted to play serious games on the international scene. And this could happen again, and then all of our nice talks about the cost and the opportunity cost and the social and all of this is swept away. We are in a political world, and something has to happen. To quote Bob Dylan, who has a song on the political world. But in any case, the key thing then is to say, and this is where those tools that mix political and social and others and ecological come together. The decision is not going to be one purely on economic term or even ecological. Each one of these is going to have an importance, and the beauty of those instruments is that in our role, I think, at the table is just to put everything in front of decision makers and to agree that they are the ones who are going to decide. It's the region, and to try and put then as much of this information as possible. There is a cost to the use of water, but that can be equivalent to the cost of other policy directions in one way or the other. The key issue is the one that for whatever we have right now in the mix, it's not working. We have people dying of hunger at this point. So as we think of the longer term, certainly it's extremely important to have solutions that address these issues. The fact that right now there is something that doesn't work in the system and that we need to solve it. As we try and find those solutions, the way I see it is that the direct investments that are going to happen are not going to be unidimensional. We're not going to say it's there's this dream that as a region we can become completely self-sufficient, but to put enough of those values and data in the equation that is not too distorted. And here I'd like to go to the second part, which is the poverty reduction and things and those aspects, and link it to something I had to very quickly brush through, but that are really another area where I believe that we can link the issue of governance with food security, as Clemens very clearly, I think it was an excellent juxtaposition that he did between the macro and the micro. At the micro level, one way of linking the issues of governance and all of that is to really give the local communities a way of saying it's not just a little poverty reduction project here or there of education or increased income for women. We know that these work at the local level, but to link it to the local government and governance part of saying, in any case, we have those regions that within a country have been disadvantaged in for one reason or the other, and Tunisia is one example. I visited Tunisia about 3 months after the revolution. They had created one new institution, which was a ministry basically of territorial development, of regional economic development, because they knew that was one of the issues that they need to deal with. And then how do you address how do you then adjust that disparity of development between the two? You, through what I think are hopeful policies that could be implemented, you let the local people decide on what are those areas that distinguish their region from other regions. what are those areas where they could maybe create value added economic activities. Maybe it's agriculture, maybe it's not, but it's some of these activities that are basically at the local level, at the micro level, that can have repercussions both on poverty and on the food security part. To say that it already exists, we don't, but that's one of the areas where in my intervention I was hoping that we could, both from a research standpoint but also from trying to change some of the governance interventions to try and address this issue of food security and poverty alleviation. I hope I addressed the two issues that you mentioned.
On the issue of information, I do believe information is power. And let me just give you a few examples. So the DC public schools send me a report of how my son's school performs in terms of what percent of the students are above grade reading level, what percent are above grade level in math or meet grade level expectations, et cetera. Then what does a parent do? I mean, the thing they care most about is their kids. They complain if those things don't look good. And that gets, so in areas where parents are involved, the schools are actually very good. And this is the kind of community-driven development we need to see much more of that comes via information. Let me give some more examples. In Georgia, one of the ways they reduced corruption was Saakashvili showed up at a ministerial meeting with pictures of the houses owned by government officials. They clearly could not afford those houses on their salaries. So it's this kind of information that gets people to act. Subsidy reform. So doing subsidy reform is very difficult because people are afraid of what they might get in exchange from the government, and there's loss aversion. They don't want to lose a benefit they have. But how do you get people to accept that it's really inefficient? It's an information campaign. So Indonesia did this when they did subsidy reform. Iran did this before their subsidy reform. And currently in Egypt, there's a big campaign going on about who fuel subsidies are largely benefiting, in a hopes that this is a first step into addressing that issue, which of course is important also for the IMF program. So information also can be used to get the public support you need for good reforms. Then finally on income inequality, and Clemens mentioned this in his presentation, that if you look at data from this region, actually there's not much income inequality and it hasn't been increasing. So there's, given what people say, there's sort of three possibilities. One, the data's crap. Two, there's a perception of inequality, but it's not actually a reality, so we need to understand that. And the third is it's much more about equality of opportunity, not income inequality. So it's about the ability of someone who's born from uneducated parents to be able to get educated and get a white-collar job, that ability to shift out of the position, which there is research starting to show that doesn't happen. So it might be about something else. But without the data, we don't know, and if we don't know, how can we possibly have the appropriate intervention? So while it's not, I mean, surely we need other, it's more than just information. Obviously, there's other constraints, but information is such a big part of it to get people involved. And when people are involved, then things can really start moving in the right direction.
Comments?
Yeah, let me add one thing to the information and then one thing on the water. I also think information is absolutely critical, but not only information, but also quality information. You see that quite a lot nowadays when you travel in Egypt and in other Arab countries. There's this new freedom, and it's great freedom of expression, but that also leads to the fact that everybody is now talking about everything and twittering and tweeting and whatever else you can do nowadays. So I have a feeling, and many people have that feeling, that people are also really getting confused. So now what can I believe, what not? Is it like this or is it like that? And so I think the quality, trustful sources, high-level kind of research quality is also very important in that regard. And then on the water, I think there's almost something like a water transformation going on, because right now most of the water is used for agriculture. But now if we talk about, you know, export-led growth and tourism and all this other stuff, then needs a lot of water as well. So the share of water to agriculture will probably become less over time. How to deal with that? At the same time, population keeps growing very rapidly, again, putting some pressure on the water side. What can be done about it? There's, especially in the Gulf countries, there are some initiatives of, you know, trying to bring down the cost of desalination from the sea. And I guess that's a good initiative. The costs are still very high. And talking to people that know something about water, they tell me, you can desalinate water for drinking and maybe for manufacturing, perhaps in 20, 30 years at a reasonable cost. But for agriculture, forget it. It will always be too expensive. So that kind of the water transformation will just make agricultural production harder, I guess, in the future.
Well, Nadine, go ahead.
But just to also not to forget Nadine, that certainly I think it would be very good to see how the two programs could. Certainly, we at ESCO would welcome being able to see how the two databases, two programs can communicate. That would be great.
Okay. I'm afraid we're over our allotted time. I want to thank everyone for all their wonderful questions, and if there are still any remaining burning questions that you have for any of the speakers, you might see if they would be available after the talk right now to ask them. But in the meantime, thank you very much for coming, and wanted to let you know that the video of this seminar, the PowerPoints, and podcast will be available online shortly. So if you want to access those, feel free. Thank you. Thanks very much.